Welcome back to our introduction on the French Revolution, and we are moving back into our look into the political order in France, the part 2. This video also has part 1 of the social order of France, but let's finish off with the political order. So, in this session, we are going to have a look at two main areas for the political order, and they are the administrative and political inefficiencies of French society, as well as the nature of public perception towards the king, which involves something called the Little Academy and just the general beliefs that the public held about the king and his role in France. So let's start off with the administrative and political inefficiencies. Now, William Doyle, who wrote the Oxford History of the French Revolution, he identifies the fact that it was really confusing to be a part of French society. You could live in one particular area and have a whole different variety of laws and rules and obligations to both church and the government to the person that lived in the town next to you. It changed heaps. And so William Doyle identifies that in 1776 there were 39 provinces, 36 administrative regions, 13 jurisdictional regions, which were overseen by the parliaments that we mentioned before, so the high law courts. And there were also 18 I need to learn how to say this word properly, archiepiscopal regions, which were basically church regions, but the larger regions which were governed by the church, and then a smaller 136 dioceses. And so within these areas, an individual didn't have the same laws applied to them as somebody in a different area, and they could have different tax rates, different obligations to their feudal lords, and so there was no equality within French society for those whom the laws applied to. Public perception. How did the public view the king? And it's useful in this discussion to go back to the quote from Jacques Rousseau that we had in the previous session. And the quote was, "The king in his palace is the image of God in his heaven, who sets the whole of nature in motion." It gives us an understanding of the way in which public perception towards the king operated, although you could argue that as the bishop and a spokesman, Jacques Rousseau was trying to create that public belief, and maybe it wasn't necessarily ingrained within public perception yet. Anyway, so for Louis XIV, he established what is called the Little Academy. And Peter Burke, who's a cultural historian, he identifies this as being really the equivalent of a modern PR agency, a public relations agency. What they did, the Little Academy, was create almost like a unified body of cultural works that promoted the perceptions and beliefs of or towards the king, the reigning king of the time. And this happened under Louis XIV, and there's a whole body of artwork that establishes and supports this. Now, this is actually a really fascinating theory because it means that there was really a kind of propaganda campaign going on to support the monarchy, and that people were, the really basic way of saying is being brainwashed, but at least having their thoughts turned towards a positive perception of the king, to reinforce the concept of absolute monarchy and divine rights that we touched on in the previous session. Now, there were a few public beliefs that the populace had towards the king, and they were kind of a mixture of beliefs and expectations. Now, the first one is they had the belief that he would be competent. The king would be competent at running the business of governing the country. Now, what this actually meant is it's a double-edged sword. If he's doing a good job, then yeah, the public are perceiving the king to be doing a good job, then they feel positively towards the king. But if things go wrong, if there's natural disasters, if there's higher taxes, if there are issues with food supply, then the king is the one who is blamed for it, whether or not he is directly responsible for that or not. So it works both ways. Now, number two, dynastic prestige lent authority. This is really important because the king is not just a despot. He's not just somebody who's taking power and abusing it for his own purposes, at least within French society at this time. Louis the 14th, 15th, 16th, they're all part of a dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty, which dates back to Henry IV in 1589. So he, as the king, Louis XIV, 15th and 16th, they have the prestige of centuries of rule. And so therefore their authority is not really just from them individually, it actually comes from centuries of rule and centuries of inherent authority where the populace knows nothing else than the Bourbon dynastic rule. So they expect him to reign and to govern well because his family has reigned and governed in the past and will presumably continue to do so into the future. Now, the third point is that he was also the father and protector of the people. He was to look after and care for the French populace. And if he did this, great. And if he didn't, well, then public sentiment would turn against him and there would be consequences from that. Now let's move on to the social order in France, and this is going to be part one of our look at the social order. Part one, we're going to look at what corporate society means and also the social concept of privilege. Also, what deference was and the role that it played in French society, as well as a brief introduction to the very, very important concept of the three estates within French society. So let's begin with corporate society, privilege, and deference. We'll combine those together. So we need to start off here with looking at the old regime and what the old regime is, because this word and term might get thrown around a bit as you read about and study the French Revolution. And it's really simple. It means French society before the Revolution. I'll leave it there. That's it. Now, corporate society. Corporate society is very important to wrap your head around because it's different in how we approach our understanding of current society that we live in. So corporate society essentially means that certain groups have different laws and conditions that don't apply to other groups within that same society. So within our Western democratic society, we have the expectation, maybe naive as it might be if we're being cynical, that everybody has the same rules and laws and regulations applied to them regardless of wealth and status and privilege. So that means that, let's say, Tony Abbott is to be held to the same laws as I am as a teacher. Now, you could argue that in our society that may not be entirely realistic, but the fact is, that is enshrined within our constitution and our law. That is not the way in which French society operated under the old regime pre-revolution. And this relates now to the concept of privilege. Privilege in French society has a definition of being a private set of laws between the king and a certain group. Now, this privilege can take two forms. It can be an honorific privilege, or it can be a fiscal privilege. Now, the honorific privilege generally relates to status and markers of that status. So that could be wearing a sword in public is a marker of a nobility, or noble, and is a honorific privilege that nobles get to do. A fiscal privilege would be tax exemptions. So we'll get into this in more detail when we look at the first estate of the church, but we'll see that the church had significant tax exemptions, which were a fiscal privilege within the corporate society of France. So there are a few terms and definitions that we need to understand, and you need to make sure that you are well versed in using those terms like privilege, corporate society, old regime, honorific privilege, fiscal privilege. So keep those in mind. Now, deference is a bit of a smaller term. It's something that you just need to be aware of, in that deference was essentially the concept that you had to recognize social difference. So if you were a farmer, you had to show deference to nobility, to farm holding nobility, because it was recognized that you were less prestigious than they were. And so French society is layered, or is filled with these different layers of deference, of paying respect to those of social influence. So just keep a hold of that as we continue to look at French society throughout this period. Now, the three estates. I'm just going to give you an overview, and we're not going to go into huge amounts of detail with this, but the three estates comprised of the first estate being the clergy, that means the members of the church, the second estate being the nobility, and the third estate essentially being everybody else. But you need to be careful and not just assume that the third estate was simply peasants, as in those who work the land, agricultural farmers. Okay, because the third estate was actually comprised of around 99% of the French population, and not everybody was a farmer. There were significant numbers of people who were businessmen, lawyers, artisans, so people who created things, shop owners, merchants. There's a whole array of people who were a part of that third estate and were relatively wealthy, but weren't peasants. And so we'll get into the nature of the different estates as we go on. But what you need to understand is this. Firstly, within French society, there were three estates. One of them was the clergy, the first was the clergy, the second was the nobility, and the third was everybody who was not a part of the first or second estates. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, but what you need to know is that estates are not social classes, as we would generally know them within the study of a society. Social classes are generally smaller. There's more of them. But within French society, there's actually only three estates. They're larger groupings than classes. And also, there is a huge disparity in wealth within the classes, within the estates, not necessarily between the estates themselves. So within the clergy, you could have an archbishop who is vastly more wealthy than the village priest. Within the nobility, you could have an extremely wealthy landowning noble in comparison to a noble who is barely struggling to survive within the ranks of the nobility. Within the third estate, you could have wealthy bankers and businessmen who are on the cusp of buying a lower nobility spot, which is something we'll talk about in the next session. And then you can have farmers who have gone into debt and sold themselves into slavery, who are called serfs. So there's a huge disparity between those. And you need to understand that estates, the term estate does not translate into social class. It is different, and you need to recognize the differences. So for preparation for class, there are two things that you need to be reading. First off, you need to read the first URL that is listed, and this gives you an extract from Louis XVI's personal account book. It's pretty interesting, and it gives you an understanding of some of the different areas in which Louis XVI would spend his money. And it's very, very interesting to see the different expenses that he has and where they are going and how they are contributing to his personal lifestyle, but also possibly compare that to the charitable donations and think what you make an opinion about those differences there. But what you need to do is read that extract and consider what it tells us about the wealth of the French king. We'll discuss that and answer a few questions about that in class. The second thing that you need to do for class is to, again, look at the extract that's listed, and that extract is a political pamphlet from January 1789. And what I want you to ask or consider is what's the main argument that's being put forward by the author? What is the author trying to argue and discuss, and how does the author do this? You need to be able to argue that point. If you say, this is the argument that the author is putting forward, my response will be, how do you know that? What evidence do you have to support your argument? We'll again have a discussion of this in class. I'll have hard copies available for you. See you in class.